The one thing necessary for a Christian, as Mary reminded Martha in Bethany, is to center his whole life on Christ. It is not possible, however, to love Christ with one's mind, heart, soul, and strength without having a preferential love for the poor. As Pope Francis wrote in the Apostolic Exhortation, The Joy of the Gospel, God's heart a special place for the poor, so much so that he himself became poor. The entire history of redemption is marked by the presence of the poor. Salvation came to us from the yes, uttered by a lowly maiden from a small town on the fringes of a great empire. The Savior was born in a manger, in the midst of animals. Like children of poor families, he was presented at the temple along with 2 turtle doves, the offering made by those who could not afford a lamb. He was raised in a home of ordinary workers and worked with his own hands to earn his bread. When he began to preach the kingdom, crowds of the dispossessed followed him, illustrating his words, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor." He assured those burdened by sorrow and crushed by poverty that God has a special place for them in his heart. "Blessed are you poor, yours is the kingdom of God." He made himself one of them. "I was hungry, and you gave me food to eat." And he taught them that mercy towards all of these is the key to heaven. It must be pointed out, however, that God's love for human beings is universal. He wants all souls to be saved. The preferential option for the poor that is part of the Christian spirit cannot be excluded. That is, it cannot, under the name of Marxist class warfare, lead to a hatred for the rich, for the powerful. In fact, Christ himself also showed that his preferential option for the poor of his times did not preclude his loving and being close to some persons belonging to the well-to-do in the Jewish community. For example, the siblings of Bethany, Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, for whom our Lord had a very special affection. Zacchaeus, the rich man who invited him to a feast. Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, who took him down from the cross, anointed his body, and buried him in a tomb where he lay for 3 days. In fact, the true sign of imitating Christ is to do everything possible to convert the rich and the powerful of today so that they can also exercise a preferential option for the poor by working for the common good and living according to the social doctrine of the Church about the universal destination of goods and the social function of private property, as Pope Francis has been insistently reminding the faithful before and during his pontificate. Neither can a truly Christ-centered person be exclusive in his preferential option for the poor. As we can read in this book, Jesus-Centered, Guide to the Happiest Life, by Filipino educator and theologian, Dr. Raul Nidor, Pope Francis illuminates 3 types of poverty we are called to alleviate. There is the material destitution of those who lack conditions opposed to human dignity. These lack basic rights and needs such as poor, water, hygiene, work. Then there are the new forms of poverty, the homeless, the addicted, refugees, indigenous peoples, the elderly, migrants, victims of various kinds of human trafficking, women who endure situations of exclusion, mistreatment, and violence, unborn children, the most defenseless and innocent among us. Secondly, there is the moral destitution of those who become slaves to vice and sin, alcohol, drugs, gambling, prostitution, pornography, and so forth. Finally, there is spiritual destitution. As Pope Francis said, there is only one real kind of poverty, not living as children of God and brothers and sisters of Christ. The popes and Saint Teresa of Calcutta had been saying that the greatest poverty is not to know Christ. It still pains me to remember how a small group of nuns in Manila got infected with the doctrinal error of the wrong kind of liberation theology in the early 1970s, during the great doctrinal confusion that prevailed after the Second Vatican Council. Whereas before they were avid catechists teaching children in the slum areas the doctrine of Christ, they decided, upon being convinced by a group of leftists, to stop teaching catechism because, quote unquote, the poor cannot eat doctrine. This unfortunate doctrinal aberration is diametrically opposed to what Pope Francis wrote in The Joy of the Gospel. The worst discrimination which the poor suffer is the lack of spiritual care. The greatest majority of the poor have special openness to the faith. They need God, and we must not fail to offer them His friendship, His blessing, His word, the celebration of the sacraments, and a journey of growth and maturity in the faith. Our preferential option for the poor must mainly translate into a privileged and preferential religious care. Saint Teresa of Calcutta, who practiced preferential option for the poor to the highest degree, always taught, you cannot see Jesus in the poor unless you can see Him in the Eucharist. Practicing the works of mercy should be second nature to a Jesus-centered soul. He gives priority to the spiritual works of mercy, which are counsel the doubtful, instruct the ignorant, admonish the sinners, comfort the afflicted, forgive offenses, bear wrongs patiently, pray for the living and the dead. Then come the corporal works of mercy. Feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, shelter the homeless, visit the sick, visit the imprisoned, bury the dead. While practicing the works of mercy, we must be careful not to treat the beneficiaries as mere objects of pity, rather as persons made unto the image of God. Charitable works must always be accompanied by empathy, that is, putting ourselves in the shoes of the needy, listening to them closely, understanding their needs. As Saint Josemaria Escriva, founder of Opus Dei, taught, charity, more than in giving, consists in understanding. In his early years as a priest, Saint Josemaria spent countless hours ministering to the needs of the poorest of the poor in the slum areas of Madrid. He would ask some university students to accompany him, and he would encourage them to engage the poor whom they were visiting in lively and friendly conversations, inquiring about their lives and interests, while bringing them simple material gifts. This practice has been kept up to this day in student and youth centers under the apostolic direction of Opus Dei in more than 80 countries all over the world. I know of Christian families who have the practice of bringing their very young children to regular visits to the poor. This is a very effective means of educating children in the preferential option for the poor. As early as possible, Christians should learn to appreciate the poor in their goodness, in their experience in life, in their culture, and in their ways of living the faith. True love is always contemplative and permits us to serve the other not out of necessity or vanity, but rather because he or she is beautiful above and beyond mere appearances. Only on the basis of this real and sincere closeness can one properly accompany the poor on their faith of liberation. Only this will ensure that every Christian community, the poor feel at home. When the children of these families grow up, they will look at the poor with great respect and affection. This is the reason why the Second Vatican Council exhorted parents to teach their children from their earliest education to be solicitous for the material and spiritual needs of their neighbor. Children should especially realize that, as Pope Francis wrote, The greatest gift we can give to the poor is our friendship, our concern, our tenderness, our love for Jesus. To receive Jesus is to have everything. To give him is to give the greatest gift of all. I would like to make special mention of Christians who can most directly address the structural roots of poverty. As a professional economist, I must admit that in general, our profession has been remiss in responding to the following plea of Pope Francis in the Joy of the Gospel. The need to resolve the structural causes of poverty cannot be delayed, not only for the pragmatic reason of its urgency for the good order of society, but because society needs to be cured of a sickness which is weakening and frustrating. Indeed, there will always be a need for the corporal works of mercy because it is difficult to avoid people being impoverished by natural calamities, wars, pandemics, as the whole world is experiencing today, and economic and financial crises. That is why, as Pope Francis admits, welfare projects which meet certain urgent needs should be considered merely temporary responses. A temporary response that is urgently needed in this times of a pandemic, when tens of millions of people all over the world have joined those with inadequate food, is to have civil society partner with the business sector to address the scandal cited by Pope Francis, in which millions of people all over the world go to bed hungry every day, while literally billions of tons of food are being thrown away. He called this as a throw-away culture. In Manila, as in many other cities of the world, there are initiatives of concerned citizens who are recycling the soon-to-expire and other surplus products of food manufacturing firms and restaurants in order to distribute them to those suffering from hunger in such institutions as orphanages, prisons, schools where the children of the poor study and require supplementary nutrition, and other feeding clinics attached to public institutions. This is a laudable response to the very first corporal work of mercy, which is to feed the hungry. Pope Francis points out, however, that as long as the problems of the poor are not radically resolved by rejecting the absolute autonomy of markets and financial speculation, and by attacking the structural causes of inequality, no solution will be found for the world's problems, or for that matter to any problem. Inequality is the root of social ills. Indeed, the majority of economists, although there were exceptions, gave both politicians and business leaders the excuse and license to propound the absolute autonomy of markets by spreading a distorted figure of the businessman, forgetting that someone in business is also a human being who by his very nature is obliged to contribute to the common good in his work or occupation. Microeconomic theory presented a caricature of the businessman or entrepreneur as someone exclusively engaged in the maximization of profit to the exclusion of any other social objective. This started with the reference to Adam Smith's famous saying that it was not the benevolence of the baker that moves him to sell bread, but to make a profit in doing so. Then this reason for the invisible hand of the market given by Adam Smith took an even more dogmatic form with the saying of Nobel Prize winner in economics Milton Friedman, who insisted that the only purpose of business is to make a profit. The reigning theory behind the Western form of free market capitalism became gospel truth that led to the creation of capitalist monsters symbolized by Gordon Gekko of the Hollywood film Wall Street, that made famous the aphorism, "Greed is good." To sanitize this extreme theory of free market capitalism, some tried to make it more socially palatable by inventing the trickle-down theory, that economic growth resulting from the pursuit of maximum profit by business people will lead to a trickle-down of material benefits to the poor. This trickle-down to the poorest of the poor, never happened, although there was some lifting of other boats by the rising tide. It cannot be denied that, especially in China, the move towards more freedom of economic enterprise by the liberalization of markets helped hundreds of millions to rise from mass poverty. There are, however, still hundreds of millions in China and the rest of the world who are still waiting for the benefits to trickle down to them. There is no substitute to political and economic leaders applying policies and solutions that directly address the marginalization of the poor without having to wait for free markets to trickle down their benefits. There is irreparable harm done to generations who go hungry and are denied the most basic needs of the body. Pope Francis, especially having seen at very close range the failure of trickle-down economics in the whole of Latin America, cannot be clearer in his message to economic and political leaders who truly want to be followers of Christ. We can no longer trust in the unseen forces and the invisible hand of the market. Growth in justice requires more than economic growth. While presupposing such growth, it requires decisions, programs, mechanisms, and processes specifically geared to a better distribution of income, the creation of sources of employment, and an integral promotion of the poor, which goes beyond a simple welfare mentality. I am far from proposing an irresponsible populism as occurred recently in Venezuela, the Pope said. But the economy can no longer turn to remedies that are a new poison, such as attempting to increase profits by reducing the workforce and thereby adding to the ranks of the excluded. It is a greater hope that economic and political leaders, especially among Christians, will heed the words of Pope Francis, so that to them also Jesus Christ can address these following words: "Come, you are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Being Christ-centered is to have a preferential option for the poor, especially on the part of important officials and personalities who can make a difference in the political, economic, and business worlds. As Pope Francis reiterated in Fratelli Tutti, love overflowing with small gestures of mutual care is also civic and political, and makes itself felt in every action that seeks to build a better world. For this reason, charity finds expression not only in close and intimate relationships, but also in macro relationships, social, economic, and political. Thank you very much.